Hey, everybody. I'm so glad to be back again tonight for episode 2 for my series, Colonial Witch Trial Misconceptions. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the misconception of land grabs. But I'd like you to see a couple of my sources that I've used for tonight's presentation. And the first one is the Salem Witch Trials, a day-by-day chronicle of a community under siege by Marilynne Roache. And this is a must-read or a must-have for any of you that are seriously studying the Salem Witch Trials. And another book I have, which I don't have the sleeve for, but it is a great book published in 2021, and it's about the life of Rebecca Nurse, and it's called A Salem Witch by Dan Gagnon. A great book. So you all know me as Mary. Again, I am the 9 times great-granddaughter of Sarah Wiles. And again, I'm so glad to be here tonight. So let's begin. Back in the day, the 1600s, that is, the colonies didn't have the court system which exists today. Sure, some of the learned men read law books, but lawyers were scarce. Therefore, only the basic concepts of the English property laws were integrated in the Massachusetts Bay Colony court system. The Book of General Laws and Liberties concerning the inhabitants of Massachusetts states the laws and liberties of the 1640s protected people from being oppressed by their government. The inhabitants were not to be so restricted that they could not move about freely and lawfully. The first law and liberty clearly states that any authority figure could not come to a man's home and take away his stuff or his land, nor could anyone in authority deprive a man of his family or possessions without just cause. Further in this document, one finds the court will not arrest anyone who owes a debt if that man has the means and agrees to make payment from his estate. However, if a man hides valuables from the court, he will be thrown in jail at his own expense. Only then, it seems, could authorities confiscate items to pay the debt. The confiscated items were not then to be sold to anyone but the English nation. In 1692, Sheriff George Corwin pushed the bounds of that law with regards to confiscation of items from some of the wrongfully convicted and executed for witchcraft. According to author Marilynne Roache in her book, The Salem Witch Trials, which I just showed you, after Giles Corey was pressed to death, Corwin arrived at his farm to collect the balance owed for Corey's jail fees. Giles' son-in-law, John Moulton, handed over some livestock and paid the remainder with cash. Corwin did not seize any land. Marilynne further says that Moulton's actions probably saved the farm. One may interpret that to mean that Moulton had everything needed to pay the debt, and he did not have to sell any parcel or portion of the farm to someone else to obtain funds to pay those jail fees. It's also interesting to note that Giles declared his innocence to all the indictments read against him at his trial. But when asked, "How will you be tried?" he refused to say the necessary response, "By God and my country." He is, therefore, standing legally mute, according to the courts. And he stands mute for about 10 days, no less. Even when he's sent back to jail, he refused again to say, "By God and my country." And then again, he was brought back to court, still refused to say those 5 words, and then dragged to the nearby field and pressed to death. So sad. Since Giles was never convicted or found guilty for that matter, Corwin, as it seems to me, was really stretching those legal boundaries by taking possessions from someone who was never even convicted of a crime. Please watch my video on Mary Parker if you would like to know how Sheriff Corwin dealt with her sons after her execution. Now that we know the government did not take land, there were certainly boundary disputes between neighbors in towns and villages. Farm boundary lines and deeds back then were very loosely defined. Examples would be a pile of rocks at the south of the west corner near the Andover Road, passing by the eastern corner of the Gould farm to a pine tree on the northwest, or so to speak. Well, what happened if the tree was cut down or if the rocks were removed? So sure, people were feuding over boundary lines. However, none of those cases seem to be involved in 1692 depositions, as far as I know. For an example, Rebecca and Francis Nurse leased their farm in Salem Village from Reverend James Allen. Reverend Mr. Allen had boundary issues with the Nurse neighbor, who was also, I guess, his neighbor, Zerubbabel Endicott. And I say Zerubbabel, but other people pronounce it Zerubbabel, just so you're aware. And these boundary issues between Zerubbabel and Reverend Mr. Allen were very contentious. Though the nurses were somewhat involved because they were living on the farm and all, this dispute was not a factor in Rebecca Nurse's case. After all, Zerubbabel's son, Samuel Endicott, was one of many who signed a petition basically stating that he believed that Rebecca was not guilty of the crime of witchcraft. And the full story of this dispute can be found in Dan Gagnon's wonderful book regarding the life of Rebecca Nurse, a Salem witch, and that actually begins on page 42. That being said, there were some land grabs, but not the type of land grabs of which you all might think. In Topsfield, just north of Salem Village, Jacob Town, who lived on the west side of what is now Hill Street, built his barn at the edge of his boundary. So much so that the barn was actually partly on the common land which abutted his property. Oops. And an even bigger oops was when Michael Dwinnell fenced in a significant part of the common land abutting his own farm, and he fenced it in as though it was his own, and he built a house. Now that takes crazy guts. Yet again, these misdeeds, accidental or otherwise, had no bearing on the witch trials. The one and only boundary issue, which was one very controversial dispute, was between the town of Topsfield and Salem Village, and it involved the Putnams, namely the family of Captain John Putnam, who was an uncle to Thomas Putnam Jr., the Estes, and the town families. And this did play a role in the witch trials. I did a Facebook Live event on this dispute about 2 years ago. However, I plan on filming a YouTube video in the near future on that subject on the site where it actually happened and where it all came to a fiery meeting in the woods with axes in hand. Circa the mid-1680s, and that was near the hiking trail off of Raleigh Bridge Road and in Topsfield. So feel free to give a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and I look forward to all your wonderful comments, and I will see you on October 14th for episode 3. Thank you and have a great night.